Welcome to a journey into one of the most chilling tales from the American frontier, where honest work turned deadly and the promise of fair wages became a death sentence. Before we begin this documented account, I invite you to share in the comments where you're listening from and what time of day you're experiencing this story. We're fascinated to know how these dark chapters of history reach across time and distance to find you. In the scorching summer of 1881, beneath the relentless Nevada sun, a tale unfolded that would remain buried in county records for nearly 8 decades. This is the documented story of what became known as the Silverdale Incident, a series of events surrounding a cattle ranch that promised honest work, but delivered something far more sinister to those desperate enough to accept employment from a man whose smile never reached his cold, calculating eyes. The year was 1881. Nevada had achieved statehood just 17 years earlier, and the discovery of silver in the Comstock lode had drawn fortune-seekers from across the globe. But away from the bustling mining towns, in the vast stretches of high desert rangeland, a different kind of opportunity awaited those willing to work cattle for a living wage. It was here, approximately 40 miles southeast of Carson City, that Jacob Thornfield established what appeared to be a legitimate ranching operation that would become synonymous with terror. Nevada in the 1880s remained largely untamed territory despite its statehood. The Transcontinental Railroad had connected the region to the rest of the nation, but vast areas remained isolated, governed more by personal strength and cunning than by distant federal authority. The silver boom had created pockets of civilization around mining operations, but between these settlements lay enormous expanses of desert, where a man could disappear without a trace, and no one would think to look for him. Law enforcement consisted of scattered sheriffs responsible for territories larger than some eastern states. Communication between settlements was sporadic at best, relying on occasional mail riders and the irregular passage of freight wagons. In this environment, a ranch owner held almost feudal authority over his domain, particularly one located in the remote valleys where the nearest neighbor might be 50 miles away. It was against this backdrop of isolation and limited oversight that Jacob Thornfield arrived in Nevada in early 1880. According to territorial records filed in Carson City, Thornfield claimed to be a former Texas cattleman, seeking to establish operations in Nevada's high desert country. He purchased a substantial tract of land in what is now Mineral County, paying cash for nearly 8,000 acres of rangeland that included water rights to Willow Creek, a seasonal waterway that provided the only reliable water source for miles in any direction. The purchase itself raised few eyebrows at the time. The land had been considered marginal for cattle operations due to its remote location and harsh conditions, making Thornfield's cash offer attractive to territorial land agents eager to show development in their districts. What was unusual, according to a notation in the margin of the deed recorded by clerk Samuel Morrison, was Thornfield's insistence on specific boundary markers that seemed to prioritize isolation over access to transportation routes. Morrison's personal journal, discovered in 1958 during renovation of the old territorial courthouse, contained an entry dated March 15, 1880, that read, "A Thornfield fellow strikes me as odd sort for rancher. Hands soft as bankers, but eyes hard as flint. Asked particular questions about how often law comes through these parts. Told him sheriff makes rounds maybe twice yearly, if that. Seemed pleased by this information, which I found curious for honest businessman." Jacob Thornfield himself was a man of average height but imposing presence, described in various accounts as having prematurely gray hair despite appearing to be in his early 40s, and pale blue eyes that seemed to look through rather than at the people he addressed. Unlike most cattlemen of the era, who bore the weathered appearance of men who had spent their lives outdoors, Thornfield's complexion suggested a more sedentary background, leading some to speculate about his true origins and experience with livestock. The ranch he established, which he named the Double T, was built with unusual attention to isolation and security. The main house, constructed of local stone and timber, was positioned to command views of all approaches across the valley floor. More unusually, Thornfield employed workers to dig what he claimed was a root cellar, but which extended far deeper into the hillside than necessary for food storage. Local suppliers noted his orders for unusually large quantities of lime, ostensibly for construction purposes, though the amounts seemed excessive for the buildings being erected. By the spring of 1881, the Double T appeared to be a functioning cattle operation. Thornfield had acquired several hundred head of cattle, though neighbors noted the herd size seemed to fluctuate unpredictably, sometimes appearing larger and sometimes smaller than expected for a ranch of that scale. He also began advertising for workers, posting notices in Carson City, Virginia City, and other regional settlements, seeking experienced ranch hands willing to work in remote conditions for what he advertised as generous wages. The notices themselves were carefully crafted to attract a specific type of worker. Rather than seeking experienced cowboys with established reputations, Thornfield's advertisements targeted men down on their luck, those seeking fresh starts, and particularly those without strong family connections who might inquire about their whereabouts. The language was appealing to desperate men, promising steady work, fair treatment, and wages paid promptly in cash rather than the script or credit arrangements common to many frontier employers. One such advertisement, preserved in the Virginia City Territorial Enterprise Archives, read, "Your honest work for honest men. Established cattle operation seeks reliable hands for seasonal work. Good wages, regular meals, clean quarters. Men of steady character preferred. Previous difficulties no barrier to employment for those willing to work hard and follow instructions. Inquire at Mackenzie's boarding house, Carson City." The reference to previous difficulties was particularly attractive to men who had found themselves on the wrong side of the law, or who were seeking to escape their pasts. In the frontier environment, where many men had reasons to avoid scrutiny, this represented an opportunity for legitimate employment without uncomfortable questions about background or references. Thomas Brennan was among the first to respond to Thornfield's recruitment efforts. A former miner whose luck had run out in the Comstock diggings, Brennan had been working odd jobs around Carson City when he learned of the Double T opportunity. According to a letter he wrote to his sister in San Francisco, dated April 20, 1881, Brennan was optimistic about his prospects. "Dear Mary," the letter began, "where I have secured employment with a cattle outfit southeast of here. The owner, Mr. Thornfield, seems a fair man who judges workers by their willingness to labor rather than their past circumstances. The wages are better than anything I've found since leaving the mines, and he has promised steady work through the season. I expect to have sufficient funds to visit you in San Francisco by Christmas, perhaps even enough to consider establishing myself in some small business venture." Brennan's letter continued with details that would later prove significant to investigators. "The ranch is quite isolated, which suits me well after the crowded conditions of the mining camps. Mr. Thornfield explained that the remote location allows him to offer higher wages since he saves on transportation costs and can focus on the work rather than dealing with the distractions common to operations closer to town. He has asked that workers not discuss the specific location or operations with outsiders, as he has had problems with claim jumpers and rustlers in the past. This request for secrecy was presented as a reasonable business precaution, but it served Thornfield's darker purposes by ensuring that workers' families and acquaintances would have little specific information about their whereabouts. Brennan's letter was the last communication his sister received from him, despite his promise to write regularly. The pattern established with Brennan would be repeated with subsequent workers. Men would respond to Thornfield's advertisements, travel to the remote ranch, and then seemingly vanish from all contact with the outside world. In each case, the last communication from these workers expressed satisfaction with their employment and optimism about their financial prospects. Michael O'Sullivan, an Irish immigrant who had been working construction in Virginia City, wrote to his cousin in Boston on May 15, 1881, "Wine, the work here is hard but honest, and Mr. Thornfield treats his men fairly. We are well fed and the quarters are clean, which is more than I could say for most places I've worked since arriving in America. The isolation takes some getting used to, but the pay makes it worthwhile. I should have enough saved to send for you and the children by next spring." Like Brennan's correspondence, this was the final letter O'Sullivan's family received. When his cousin wrote to Carson City authorities inquiring about Michael's whereabouts, the response was that he had likely moved on to seek work elsewhere, a common enough occurrence in the transient frontier economy that it raised no immediate suspicions. The reality of life at the Double T was far different from what these optimistic letters suggested. According to evidence that would later emerge, Thornfield's operation was not primarily focused on cattle ranching, but on a more sinister form of profit. The isolated location, the careful selection of workers without strong social connections, and the emphasis on secrecy all served to facilitate what can only be described as a systematic program of murder and robbery. Thornfield's method was methodical and calculated. Workers would be employed for several weeks, long enough to become comfortable with the routine and to lower their guard. During this period, Thornfield would carefully assess each man's financial situation, family connections, and the likelihood that their disappearance would prompt investigation. Those deemed suitable targets would then be eliminated, their possessions seized, and their bodies disposed of in the extensive underground chambers Thornfield had constructed beneath the ranch. The underground facility was far more elaborate than the simple root cellar Thornfield had claimed to be building. Archaeological investigation conducted in the 1960s revealed a complex of chambers extending nearly 100 feet into the hillside, with multiple rooms connected by narrow passages. The construction showed evidence of careful planning, with drainage systems to prevent flooding and ventilation shafts to maintain air circulation. Most disturbing were the modifications clearly intended to facilitate the disposal of human remains. Several chambers contained evidence of fires hot enough to reduce organic matter to ash, while others showed signs of chemical treatment using the lime Thornfield had purchased in such large quantities. The efficiency of the system suggested extensive experience with such activities, leading investigators to speculate that the Double T might not have been Thornfield's first such operation. The cattle operation itself served primarily as cover for these activities. While Thornfield did maintain a herd, the numbers were deliberately kept small enough to be managed by one or two trusted accomplices, men who shared in the profits of the murder scheme and who could maintain the appearance of legitimate ranching activity when occasional visitors or officials passed through the area. One of these accomplices was a man known only as Dutch Pete, whose real name was never definitively established. Described in later testimony as a large, silent man with distinctive scars across his left cheek, Dutch Pete appeared to handle the physical aspects of Thornfield's operation, while the ranch owner managed the recruitment and selection of victims. A second accomplice, identified in court records as William Cray, served as the operation's connection to the outside world, traveling to settlements to post advertisements, collect mail, and maintain the fiction that the Double T was a normal business enterprise. The selection process for victims was coldly calculated. Thornfield preferred men between the ages of 25 and 45, old enough to have accumulated some savings, but young enough to perform hard labor. He specifically sought those who were traveling alone, had mentioned having money saved, or who had indicated they were seeking long-term employment rather than temporary work. Men with families who might inquire about their whereabouts were generally avoided, as were those who had mentioned specific friends or associates who expected regular communication. Once a worker had been marked for elimination, the process followed a predictable pattern. The victim would be assigned increasingly isolated tasks, often involving work in remote areas of the ranch, where their absence would not be immediately noticed by other workers. When the opportunity arose, usually during evening hours when the victim was alone and off guard, Thornfield or one of his accomplices would strike. The method of killing varied, but evidence suggests Thornfield preferred techniques that would not damage valuable clothing or personal effects. Strangulation appears to have been common, as were blunt force injuries to the head that would cause rapid unconsciousness, followed by death. In some cases, poison may have been employed, administered in food or drink, during what the victim believed was a friendly meal or social gathering. After the murder, The victim's body would be transported to the underground chambers for disposal. Personal effects would be carefully sorted, with valuable items retained and identifying materials destroyed. Clothing in good condition would be cleaned and either sold in distant settlements or given to subsequent workers, a practice that occasionally led to uncomfortable questions when men recognized items that had belonged to missing colleagues. The financial proceeds from these murders were substantial. In addition to whatever cash the victims carried, Thornfield systematically forged documents to claim wages allegedly owed to workers who had moved on to other employment. He also sold personal effects, particularly valuable items like watches, jewelry, and quality tools, in markets far enough from the ranch to avoid recognition. More sophisticated was Thornfield's practice of assuming the identities of certain victims for financial gain. Using forged documents and the victim's personal papers, he would claim inheritance, collect debts owed to the deceased, or even sell property that the victim had owned elsewhere. This required careful selection of victims whose backgrounds Thornfield could convincingly assume, but the profits from such identity theft could be enormous. The psychological profile that emerges from the evidence suggests that Thornfield was a man of considerable intelligence and planning ability, but utterly lacking in human empathy. His correspondence with suppliers and officials reveals a man capable of maintaining a convincing facade of respectability, while simultaneously conducting systematic murder. The meticulous records he kept of his crimes suggest someone who viewed the murders as business transactions rather than acts of violence against fellow human beings. One particularly chilling document discovered during the investigation was a notebook containing what appeared to be efficiency calculations for the disposal process. Thornfield had apparently been timing how long it took to process each victim, from the initial murder through the complete disposal of remains, and had been working to streamline the operation. The cold, analytical approach to mass murder revealed a mind that had completely divorced itself from normal human moral considerations. The notebook also contained detailed profiles of potential victims, including assessments of their financial worth, family connections, and the likelihood that their disappearance would attract attention. Thornfield had developed what amounted to a scoring system for evaluating targets, with points assigned for factors such as the amount of cash they carried, the value of their personal effects, and their social isolation. These documents revealed that Thornfield's operation was far more sophisticated than a simple robbery scheme. He had created what was essentially a murder factory, designed to process victims efficiently while minimizing the risk of detection. The systematic nature of the crimes and the careful attention to operational details suggested someone with significant experience in criminal enterprise, leading investigators to speculate about his background and possible previous activities. The first indication that something was seriously wrong at the Double T came in the fall of 1881, when a series of coincidences brought the ranch to the attention of territorial authorities. The initial trigger was seemingly unrelated to Thornfield's criminal activities, involving a dispute over water rights that required a territorial surveyor to visit the ranch and assess the boundaries of Thornfield's claim along Willow Creek. The surveyor, a methodical man named Henry Caldwell, arrived at the Double T on October 15, 1881, expecting to complete his work within a few days. What he found raised immediate suspicions that had nothing to do with water rights, but everything to do with the inconsistencies he observed in the ranch's operations. Caldwell's official report, filed with the Territorial Land Office, noted several irregularities. The number of cattle on the ranch seemed insufficient for the size of the operation Thornfield claimed to be running. The bunkhouse appeared to be designed for far more workers than were present, yet Thornfield claimed to be operating with a full crew. Most puzzling were the extensive excavations around the ranch buildings, which seemed far beyond what would be necessary for normal ranching operations. More troubling were Caldwell's personal observations, recorded in a private journal that was not discovered until after his death in 1923. Thornfield maintains the appearance of a successful rancher, Caldwell wrote, but there are aspects of his operation that do not align with my experience of cattle ranching. The hands I observed seemed nervous and reluctant to speak, avoiding eye contact and giving only brief responses to questions. When I inquired about the extensive digging around the main buildings, Thornfield's explanation about improving drainage seemed insufficient given the scope of the excavation. Caldwell's journal continued with increasingly suspicious observations. This evening at dinner, I noticed that several of the workers were wearing clothing that seemed inconsistent with their apparent economic circumstances. One man wore a pocket watch of obvious quality and expense, while another had boots that appeared to be custom-made rather than the standard footwear typically available to ranch hands. When I complimented the man on his watch, he seemed uncomfortable and quickly changed the subject. Most significantly, Caldwell noted discrepancies in the stories told by different workers about their backgrounds and how they had come to work at the Double T. "The accounts do not align," he wrote. "One man claimed to have been working here for 6 months, yet another worker seemed surprised by this claim and suggested the first man had arrived only recently. There is an atmosphere of tension and secrecy that seems inappropriate for a legitimate business operation." The surveyor also observed what he described as unusual activity during the nighttime hours. "I was awakened several times during my stay by sounds of digging and the movement of heavy objects," he recorded. When I inquired about this activity the following morning, Thornfield explained that they often worked at night during the summer months to avoid the heat of the day. While this explanation seemed reasonable, the sounds I heard did not seem consistent with normal ranch work. Caldwell completed his survey work and departed the ranch on October 18th, but his suspicions prompted him to make inquiries when he returned to Carson City. His investigation revealed that several men who had been hired by Thornfield over the previous months had not been seen or heard from since traveling to the Double T, despite having promised to maintain contact with friends or family members. The surveyor's concerns might have been dismissed as the overactive imagination of a city man unfamiliar with frontier ranch life, but they coincided with other developments that were beginning to focus attention on Thornfield's operation. The most significant of these was the arrival in Carson City of Margaret O'Sullivan, sister of the missing worker Michael O'Sullivan, who had traveled from Boston to investigate her brother's disappearance. Margaret O'Sullivan was not the typical frontier woman. Educated and determined, she had worked as a teacher in Boston and possessed both the resources and the persistence to conduct a thorough investigation into her brother's fate. Unlike the cursory inquiries that had been made by other family members, Margaret's search was systematic and comprehensive. She began by retracing Michael's known movements, starting with the boarding house where he had stayed while seeking employment. The proprietor remembered Michael well and was able to provide details about his departure for the Double T, including the date and his expressed optimism about the position. More importantly, the boarding house keeper had retained a note Michael had left, providing directions to the ranch and Thornfield's name. Margaret then sought out other men who had responded to similar advertisements, hoping to find someone who had worked at the Double T and could provide information about conditions there. This proved more difficult than expected, as she was unable to locate anyone who claimed to have worked for Thornfield and subsequently left his employment. Every inquiry led to the same result. Men who had traveled to the Double T were simply never seen again. Her investigation took on new urgency when she discovered that Michael was not the only O'Sullivan family member to have disappeared in Nevada. Through correspondence with relatives in Ireland, she learned that a cousin, Patrick O'Sullivan, had also traveled to Nevada seeking work and had last been heard from in the spring of 1881. The coincidence seemed too significant to ignore, particularly when she learned that Patrick had also mentioned securing employment with a cattle operation in a remote location. Margaret's persistence began to attract official attention when she presented her findings to the territorial sheriff's office. While individual disappearances might be explained by the transient nature of frontier life, the pattern she had identified suggested something more sinister. Sheriff William Morrison, no relation to the clerk who had recorded Thornfield's land purchase, agreed to investigate the Double T, though he warned Margaret that his authority was limited and that proving wrongdoing would be difficult without concrete evidence. The sheriff's investigation began with inquiries in Carson City and other settlements about Thornfield's background and reputation. What emerged was a picture of a man who had appeared suddenly in Nevada, with substantial financial resources, but no verifiable history in cattle ranching. His references, when checked, proved to be either non-existent or connected to men who could not be located for verification. More troubling were reports from merchants and suppliers who had dealt with Thornfield. Several noted his unusual purchasing patterns, particularly his requests for large quantities of lime, and his orders for tools that seemed more suitable for excavation than for typical ranch work. A hardware store owner in Carson City recalled Thornfield's purchase of several shovels, pickaxes, and other digging implements, along with rope and canvas in quantities that seemed excessive for normal ranching operations. The investigation gained momentum when Sheriff Morrison learned of Surveyor Caldwell's recent visit to the Double T and the concerns he had expressed about the operation. Caldwell's professional observations carried weight that the concerns of family members might not, and his detailed notes provided specific points that could be investigated further. Morrison decided to visit the Double T himself, but rather than announcing his arrival, he chose to approach the ranch as if conducting a routine patrol of his territory. This decision would prove crucial, as it allowed him to observe the operation without giving Thornfield time to prepare for official scrutiny. The sheriff's visit to the Double T on November 3, 1881, immediately confirmed many of Caldwell's suspicions. Morrison found Thornfield's explanations for various aspects of his operation unconvincing, particularly regarding the number of workers he claimed to employ versus those actually present. When asked about specific individuals who were known to have traveled to the ranch seeking employment, Thornfield claimed they had worked briefly before moving on to other opportunities, but he could provide no details about where they had gone or when they had departed. Most suspicious was Thornfield's reaction to questions about the extensive excavations around the ranch buildings. His explanation about drainage improvements seemed rehearsed and inadequate, particularly when Morrison observed that the excavations appeared to extend far beyond what would be necessary for such purposes. When the sheriff requested to examine the underground areas, Thornfield became evasive and suggested that the spaces were unstable and dangerous to enter. Morrison's law enforcement experience told him that Thornfield was hiding something significant, but he lacked the legal authority to conduct a thorough search of the property without more concrete evidence of wrongdoing. He departed the ranch with a warning to Thornfield that he would be conducting regular patrols of the area, and that any reports of missing persons would be investigated thoroughly. The sheriff's visit had an immediate effect on operations at the Double T. According to later testimony from one of the few workers who survived the ranch's final days, Thornfield became increasingly agitated and began making preparations for what he called a temporary relocation of the operation. Workers were told that the ranch would be closing for the winter months and that they should seek employment elsewhere. This sudden change in plans created the opportunity that would ultimately expose Thornfield's crimes. One of the workers, a man named Samuel Fletcher, who had been employed at the ranch for only 2 weeks, became suspicious when he was told to help with what Thornfield described as cleaning and maintenance work in the underground areas. What Fletcher saw in those chambers would haunt him for the rest of his life and provide the evidence needed to bring Thornfield to justice. Fletcher's account, given to authorities after his escape from the ranch, described underground rooms that contained clear evidence of multiple murders. He reported seeing human bones, bloodstains that had been incompletely cleaned, and personal effects belonging to men who had supposedly left the ranch to seek employment elsewhere. Most horrifying were the furnaces that had been used to dispose of human remains, still containing fragments of bone and teeth that had not been completely consumed by the fires. The workers' testimony also revealed the fate of the missing men, whose disappearances had prompted the investigation. According to Fletcher, Thornfield had shown him areas where bodies had been buried after being processed in the underground chambers, pointing out the locations with a casual attitude that suggested this was routine business rather than the disposal of murder victims. Fletcher described the underground complex as a carefully designed facility for murder and disposal. The main chamber contained what appeared to be restraints built into the walls, along with tools that could only have been intended for dismembering human bodies. Adjacent rooms housed the furnaces used for cremation, while other areas contained vats filled with lime for chemical disposal of organic matter. The systematic nature of the facility horrified Fletcher, who realized that he was witnessing the infrastructure of a mass murder operation. Thornfield had apparently been refining his methods over time, creating an efficient system for eliminating victims and disposing of evidence. The workers' description suggested that dozens of men might have been processed through the facility, far more than the handful of disappearances that had been officially reported. Fletcher managed to escape from the ranch on the night of November 10, 1881, when Thornfield and his accomplices were distracted by what they believed was another routine visit from a potential worker. Instead of seeking employment, the visitor was actually an undercover deputy sent by Sheriff Morrison to gather additional intelligence about the operation. While Thornfield was occupied with maintaining his facade of legitimate business, Fletcher slipped away and made his way to Carson City to report what he had witnessed. The worker's testimony provided Sheriff Morrison with the evidence he needed to obtain warrants for Thornfield's arrest and for a comprehensive search of the Double T property. A posse was organized that included not only law enforcement officers, but also a doctor who could examine any human remains that might be discovered, and a photographer to document the evidence. The raid on the Double T took place on November 15, 1881, but when the posse arrived at the ranch, they found it apparently abandoned. Thornfield and his known accomplices had vanished, leaving behind only a few workers who claimed to know nothing about any criminal activities. The buildings appeared to have been hastily cleaned, and there were signs that attempts had been made to conceal or destroy evidence. However, the underground chambers could not be so easily sanitized. Despite Thornfield's efforts to clean the spaces, the investigation revealed overwhelming evidence of multiple murders. The chambers contained human remains in various states of decomposition, personal effects belonging to missing men, and clear signs that the spaces had been used repeatedly for the disposal of bodies. The most damning evidence was discovered in what appeared to be Thornfield's private office, where investigators found detailed records of his criminal activities. These documents, which Thornfield had apparently been unable to destroy completely before his flight, included lists of victims with notes about their financial assets, schedules for disposing of bodies, and correspondence related to the sale of property belonging to murdered men. One particularly chilling document was a ledger that treated the murders as business transactions, with entries recording the acquisition of workers, the unprocessing of their remains, and the liquidation of their assets. The cold commercial language used to describe these horrific crimes provided insight into Thornfield's mindset and the systematic nature of his operation. The ledger contained entries such as Shatunti, Brennan, processed April 25th, yield $120 cash plus pocket watch and tools. Disposal completed by May 1st. Dacho. Another entry read Shem O'Sullivan, acquired May 20th. Assessment indicates substantial savings. Processing scheduled pending verification of family connections. The clinical terminology used to describe murder and robbery revealed the complete dehumanization of victims in Thornfield's mind. The investigation also revealed the scope of Thornfield's activities. Based on the evidence recovered and the testimony of surviving workers, authorities estimated that at least 23 men had been murdered at the Double T over the course of 18 months. The actual number may have been higher, as some remains were too deteriorated to provide accurate counts, and there were indications that Thornfield had been disposing of bodies at the ranch even before he began his systematic recruitment of workers. Among the personal effects recovered from the underground chambers were items that could be traced to specific missing persons. Thomas Brennan's distinctive pocket watch, engraved with his initials, was found in a collection of valuables that Thornfield had apparently been preparing to sell. Michael O'Sullivan's immigration papers were discovered in a file of documents that Thornfield had been using to assume the identities of his victims. The financial proceeds from these murders were substantial. In addition to the cash and valuables taken directly from victims, Thornfield had generated additional income through identity theft, property fraud, and the sale of personal effects. Investigators estimated that his criminal enterprise had generated the equivalent of several $100,000 in modern currency, making it one of the most profitable criminal operations in Nevada territorial history. The search for Thornfield and his accomplices extended across the Western Territories, with wanted notices distributed to law enforcement agencies throughout Nevada, California, Arizona, and Utah. The descriptions provided by surviving workers and the photographic evidence recovered from the ranch were circulated widely, and substantial rewards were offered for information leading to their capture. Despite these efforts, Thornfield himself was never apprehended. Reports of sightings came from various locations across the West, but none could be confirmed, and the trail gradually grew cold. Some investigators believed he had fled to Mexico, where American law enforcement had limited reach, while others speculated that he might have assumed a new identity and established himself in a distant territory where his crimes were unknown. The most credible sighting came from a railroad conductor in California who reported seeing a man matching Thornfield's description boarding a southbound train in Sacramento 3 days after the raid on the Double T. The man had paid for his ticket with gold coins and had seemed nervous when asked for identification. However, by the time this report reached Nevada authorities, the trail had gone cold, and subsequent investigations in California proved fruitless. Dutch Pete, one of Thornfield's primary accomplices, was captured in California 3 months after the raid on the Double T. He had been attempting to sell jewelry that was identified as belonging to one of the murder victims, leading to his arrest and eventual extradition to Nevada for trial. His testimony provided additional details about the operation and confirmed many of the suspicions that had emerged during the investigation. According to Dutch Pete's confession, Thornfield had operated similar schemes in other locations before establishing the Double T. The accomplice claimed that Nevada was at least the third territory where Thornfield had conducted such activities, suggesting that the total number of victims might be far higher than the 23 confirmed murders at the ranch. Dutch Pete described Thornfield as a man obsessed with efficiency and profit, someone who viewed murder as simply another form of business enterprise. The accomplice testified that Thornfield had often spoken of his activities as shot harvesting, rather than killing, and had maintained detailed records not out of sentiment, but to improve the profitability of future operations. The testimony revealed that Thornfield had been planning to expand his operation, possibly establishing similar facilities in other remote locations across the West. He had apparently been studying territorial maps and population patterns, looking for areas where transient workers might disappear without attracting attention. The systematic nature of his planning suggested that the Double T murders might have been just the beginning of a much larger criminal enterprise. William Cray, the second accomplice, was never captured despite extensive efforts to locate him. Like Thornfield, he seemed to have vanished completely, leading investigators to speculate that the criminal organization might have had contingency plans for escape and relocation that allowed key members to disappear when their activities were exposed. The trial of Dutch Pete became a sensation in territorial newspapers, with detailed coverage of the evidence and testimony that revealed the full horror of the Double T operation. The proceedings provided closure for some of the families of victims, though many questions remained unanswered about the fate of their loved ones and the location of Thornfield himself. Dutch Pete was convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death, though he continued to claim that he had been merely following Thornfield's orders and had not been the architect of the criminal scheme. His execution took place in Carson City on July 15, 1882, drawing a crowd of spectators that included family members of some of the victims. The condemned man's final statement provided additional insights into Thornfield's character and methods. Dutch Pete claimed that his former boss had possessed an almost supernatural ability to identify suitable victims, seeming to sense which men would be missed and which could disappear without consequence. He described Thornfield as someone who could maintain a convincing facade of respectability while simultaneously planning murder, a skill that had allowed him to operate undetected for so long. The Double T Ranch itself was abandoned after the investigation, with the property eventually reverting to territorial ownership when no legitimate heirs could be established for Thornfield's holdings. The buildings were left to deteriorate, and the underground chambers were sealed to prevent accidents and to discourage morbid curiosity seekers who might be attracted to the site. Local residents reported that the abandoned ranch quickly gained a reputation for being haunted, with travelers claiming to hear voices and see lights in the empty buildings. While these accounts were likely the product of imagination influenced by knowledge of the crimes that had occurred there, they contributed to the site's sinister reputation and ensured that it remained uninhabited. The case had broader implications for law enforcement in the territories, highlighting the challenges of maintaining order in remote areas where criminals could operate with minimal oversight. The systematic nature of Thornfield's crimes and his ability to continue his activities for an extended period demonstrated the need for better communication between territorial authorities and more regular patrols of isolated areas. Margaret O'Sullivan's role in exposing the crimes was widely praised, and her persistence in investigating her brother's disappearance was credited with saving the lives of potential future victims. Her efforts also highlighted the importance of family members and friends in reporting disappearances and following up when official investigations seemed inadequate. The territorial government implemented several reforms in response to the Double T case, including requirements for more detailed record-keeping by employers in remote areas and regular inspections of operations that employed transient workers. While these measures could not prevent all such crimes, they made it more difficult for future criminals to operate with the same level of impunity that Thornfield had enjoyed. The psychological aspects of the case attracted attention from early criminologists, who were fascinated by Thornfield's ability to maintain a facade of respectability while conducting systematic murder. His careful selection of victims and methodical approach to disposing of evidence suggested a level of planning and emotional detachment that was unusual even among violent criminals of the era. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, one of the first physicians to study criminal psychology, wrote extensively about the Thornfield case in his 1885 treatise on criminal behavior. He noted that Thornfield's crimes differed significantly from the impulsive violence that characterized most frontier murders, instead representing what he termed commercial predation, in which victims were selected and eliminated based on calculated assessments of profit and risk. Hartwell's analysis suggested that Thornfield possessed what would now be recognized as psychopathic traits, including a lack of empathy for his victims, an ability to manipulate others through charm and false sincerity, and a capacity for long-term planning that allowed him to maintain his criminal activities while avoiding detection. The doctor's work on the case contributed to early understanding of criminal psychology and the recognition that some individuals were capable of systematic, premeditated violence on a scale that challenged conventional understanding of human behavior. The fate of Jacob Thornfield himself remained one of the great unsolved mysteries of the territorial period. Despite numerous reported sightings and extensive investigations, he was never definitively located or captured. Some historians believe he successfully escaped to Mexico or South America, where he may have continued his criminal activities under a new identity. Others speculate that he might have been killed by associates who feared he would betray them if captured, or that he died in the harsh conditions of the frontier while attempting to flee. In 1923, nearly 40 years after the Double T murders, a deathbed confession by an elderly man in Los Angeles claimed to provide information about Thornfield's fate. The dying man, who identified himself as a former associate of the killer, claimed that Thornfield had been murdered by his own accomplices in 1882, shortly after the exposure of his crimes. According to this account, the killing had been motivated by fear that Thornfield would implicate others if he were captured, and by disputes over the division of profits from their criminal activities. However, the confession could not be verified, and investigators noted several inconsistencies in the man's account that cast doubt on its reliability. The mystery of Thornfield's ultimate fate remained unsolved, adding to the enduring fascination with the case and ensuring its place in the folklore of the American frontier. The Double T case also had lasting effects on the families of the victims, many of whom never recovered their loved ones' remains or learned the exact circumstances of their deaths. The systematic destruction of evidence by Thornfield and his accomplices meant that many questions about individual victims could never be answered, leaving families to cope with uncertainty and incomplete closure. Margaret O'Sullivan continued her advocacy for victims' families long after her brother's case was resolved, working to improve communication between law enforcement agencies and to establish better procedures for investigating missing persons cases. Her efforts contributed to reforms that made it easier for families to obtain information about investigations and to ensure that disappearances were taken seriously by authorities. The site of the Double T Ranch remained abandoned for decades, gradually being reclaimed by the desert environment. Occasional visitors reported finding artifacts related to the crimes, including personal effects that had been overlooked during the original investigation. These discoveries served as grim reminders of the human cost of Thornfield's activities and the lives that had been lost in the remote Nevada Valley. In 1955, the site was designated as a historical landmark by the state of Nevada, with a small monument erected to commemorate the victims of the murders. The monument bears the names of the confirmed victims and includes an inscription acknowledging the unknown number of others who may have died at the ranch. The designation was intended both to preserve the historical significance of the site and to ensure that the victims would not be forgotten. Archaeological investigations conducted in the 1960s provided additional insights into the scope and methods of Thornfield's operation. The excavations revealed evidence of the sophisticated disposal system he had constructed and confirmed many of the details that had emerged during the original investigation. The archaeological work also uncovered personal effects belonging to victims, some of which were returned to surviving family members nearly a century after the crimes had occurred. The Double T case continues to fascinate historians, criminologists, and the general public, representing one of the most systematic and cold-blooded criminal enterprises in the history of the American frontier. The combination of Thornfield's calculated approach to murder, the isolated setting that facilitated his crimes, and the mystery surrounding his ultimate fate has ensured the case's enduring place in the annals of American crime. Modern forensic techniques have been applied to evidence from the case, providing new insights into Thornfield's methods and potentially identifying additional victims. DNA analysis of remains recovered from the site has allowed investigators to confirm the identities of some victims whose names had been lost to history, providing closure for descendants who had wondered about the fate of their ancestors. The case also serves as a reminder of the vulnerability of individuals in frontier society, particularly those who were isolated from family and community support networks. Thornfield's systematic targeting of men who were traveling alone and seeking fresh starts highlighted the dangers faced by those who found themselves without the protection of established social connections. Educational programs developed around the Double T case have been used to teach students about frontier history, criminal psychology, and the importance of law enforcement cooperation. The case provides a compelling example of how individual determination, as demonstrated by Margaret O'Sullivan's investigation, can overcome institutional indifference and lead to justice for victims of crime. The legacy of the Double T murders extends beyond their historical significance to encompass broader questions about human nature, the conditions that allow evil to flourish, and the importance of vigilance in protecting vulnerable members of society. The case demonstrates how the promise of honest work and fair treatment can be weaponized by those with malicious intent, and how isolation and desperation can make individuals vulnerable to predation. Recent research has uncovered additional evidence suggesting that Thornfield's criminal network may have been more extensive than originally believed. Documents discovered in various archives across the West indicate that similar operations may have been conducted in Colorado, Arizona, and California during the same period, all bearing the hallmarks of Thornfield's methodology. A letter found in the Colorado State Archives in 2003 describes the disappearance of several miners who had responded to advertisements for ranch work in remote areas. The language used in the advertisements and the pattern of disappearances closely match those associated with the Double T case, suggesting that Thornfield or his associates may have been operating multiple facilities simultaneously. Similarly, records from Arizona territorial authorities describe a cattle ranch operation that was abandoned suddenly in 1881, leaving behind evidence of suspicious activities. While no direct connection to Thornfield has been established, the timing and circumstances of the abandonment coincide with the exposure of the Double T crimes, raising the possibility that the criminal organization had been forced to shut down multiple operations when their activities came to light. These discoveries have led some historians to speculate that the Double T case may represent only a small portion of a much larger criminal enterprise that operated across the American West during the 1880s. The systematic nature of the crimes and the sophisticated methods employed suggest an organization with significant resources and experience, capable of establishing and maintaining multiple murder facilities across vast distances. The possibility that Thornfield was part of a larger criminal network has implications for understanding the true scope of his crimes and the number of victims who may have fallen prey to his organization. If similar operations were indeed conducted in other territories, the total death toll could be far higher than the 23 confirmed murders at the Double T Ranch. Contemporary law enforcement agencies have expressed interest in applying modern investigative techniques to the historical evidence from the Double T case and related incidents. Cold case investigators believe that DNA analysis, geographic profiling, and other modern methods might provide new insights into the crimes and potentially identify additional victims or even living descendants of those involved. The enduring fascination with the Double T case reflects broader cultural interests in true crime, frontier history, and the psychology of serial killers. The case combines elements that continue to captivate audiences, including the remote setting, the systematic nature of the crimes, and the mystery surrounding the perpetrator's ultimate fate. Documentary filmmakers and authors have produced numerous works about the case, each attempting to shed new light on the events and their significance. These productions have helped to keep the memory of the victims alive, while also serving to educate new generations about this dark chapter in American frontier history. The case has also influenced fictional works, with several novels and films drawing inspiration from the events at the Double T Ranch. While these fictional adaptations often take liberties with the historical facts, they serve to introduce the story to wider audiences and maintain public interest in the case. As we reflect on this dark chapter of frontier history, we are reminded that the American West was not only a land of opportunity and adventure, but also a place where the absence of established institutions and social structures could create conditions that allowed the worst aspects of human nature to manifest. The story of Jacob Thornfield and the Double T Ranch serves as a sobering counterpoint to romanticized narratives of frontier life, illustrating the very real dangers that faced those who ventured into the remote areas of the developing American territories. The men who died at the Double T were seeking nothing more than honest work and the opportunity to build better lives for themselves and their families. Their tragic fate reminds us of the importance of protecting the vulnerable and ensuring that the promise of opportunity is not used as a lure for those who would exploit and harm others. In remembering their stories, we honor their memory and acknowledge the human cost of the frontier experience. Today, the site where the Double T Ranch once stood is marked only by scattered foundation stones and the small monument erected to commemorate the victims. The desert has reclaimed most traces of the buildings where so much horror occurred, but the memory of what happened there continues to serve as a reminder of the capacity for both evil and justice that exists within human society. The case of Jacob Thornfield and the Double T Ranch remains one of the most chilling examples of systematic murder in American frontier history, a testament to the darkness that can lurk behind promises of honest work and fair treatment. For those who seek to understand the full complexity of the American frontier experience, the story of the men who answered Thornfield's advertisements and never returned home serves as a sobering reminder that not all who ventured west in search of opportunity found what they were seeking. In the end, the Double T case stands as both a historical curiosity and a moral lesson, reminding us that vigilance against predators and protection of the vulnerable are eternal responsibilities that transcend time and place. The men who died in that remote Nevada valley were seeking nothing more than the chance to earn an honest living, and their memory deserves to be preserved as a warning against those who would exploit such basic human needs for evil purposes. The investigation into the Double T murders also revealed the importance of persistence and determination in the pursuit of justice. Margaret O'Sullivan's refusal to accept official indifference to her brother's disappearance ultimately led to the exposure of Thornfield's crimes and potentially saved the lives of future victims. Her example serves as an inspiration to those who refuse to let the powerful silence the voices of the vulnerable. The case continues to resonate today as communities across America grapple with issues of worker exploitation, human trafficking, and the vulnerability of those seeking economic opportunity. While the specific circumstances of the frontier era may be unique, the underlying dynamics of predation and exploitation remain relevant to contemporary society. The story of the Double T Ranch serves as a reminder that evil often wears a respectable face, and that those who would harm others frequently exploit the basic human needs for work, shelter, and belonging. The men who died at Thornfield's hands were not naive or foolish. They were simply people seeking honest work, who encountered a predator skilled at exploiting their desperation and hope. As we remember the victims of the Double T murders, we also acknowledge the courage of those who refuse to let their deaths go unnoticed or unavenged. The persistence of family members, the diligence of law enforcement officers, and the bravery of witnesses like Samuel Fletcher all contributed to ensuring that justice was ultimately served, even if incompletely. The legacy of the Double T case extends far beyond its historical significance to encompass timeless lessons about human nature, the importance of community vigilance, and the eternal struggle between those who would exploit others and those who would protect the vulnerable. In remembering this dark chapter of American history, we honor not only the victims, but also those who fought to ensure that their deaths would not be in vain.